I mean, so it wasn't like an off-color joke, this like multi-page email from some who.
Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. My name is Morgan Ricks, and I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be moderating this panel. The title is Global Reverberations, and we'll be speaking about global dimensions of a lot of the topics that have been touched on in the sessions of the past couple of days of this wonderful conference. We'll be speaking about the international dimensions of central banks' operations and their economic and geopolitical repercussions. And we're really fortunate to have a distinguished set of speakers on this panel, whom I will introduce. So first, Ilene Grabel. She's the distinguished university professor in the middle, distinguished university professor at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She's the author of When Things Don't Fall Apart, Global Financial Governance and Developmental Finance in an Age of Productive Incoherence. That's from MIT Press. It's a prize-winning book. She's also the author-editor of Reclaiming Development with Ha-Joon Chang. She's done commissioned research for a wide array of international organizations and NGOs. Second, Jonathan Kirshner will go next. He's a professor of political science and international studies at BU. And his research focuses on international relations, political economy, especially macroeconomics and money, and politics and film. And I hope we can work some movies into the conversation. And he's the author of numerous books, including American Power After the Financial Crisis. And his two most recent books are An Unwritten Future, Realism, Uncertainty, and World Politics, that's from Princeton, and The Downfall of the American Order, that's Cornell University Press, with Peter Katzenstein. Finally, Carolyn Sissoko is an economist. She works on macro finance with an emphasis on the evolution of financial regulation. She's written widely and influentially on the history of the money market and banking and financial practices, and she's often finds herself as a critic of mainstream economic models. So with that, we'll begin with the presentation. So Ilene will be first.
Great, thanks, Morgan. And many thanks to Christine for bringing us all together. I found this event really fascinating. It's a new community for me. I want to begin by just noting some recent remarks by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He recently identified failed global financial governance as one element of what he termed a five-alarm global fire. He made the case for global financial governance reform quite plainly. He said, let's tell it like it is. The global financial system is morally bankrupt, it favors the rich, and it punishes the poor. I agree, and I suspect most of you here do as well. And I'd like to go a bit further than the Secretary General. I think we all share the view that the US and the global financial systems have long been anti-developmental, extractive, exclusionary, and volatile. This has been especially the case during and since the long neoliberal era, but the present moment is marked by an unusually poisonous cocktail of problems precisely when global vulnerabilities and demands are most severe. Challenges across the financial landscape are mutually reinforcing, they have vast global reverberations, and they hold contradictory and uncertain implications for the shape and the resilience of an increasingly fractured global financial order. The broader backdrop, of course, doesn't help. We live in a world in which rentiers, lobbyists, and autocrats have free run. Regulators lack the political independence, the authority, the will, and the foresight to take on the worst financial excesses. Everything, including nature, is securitized and financialized on the false promise that this is somehow generative of climate finance. Multilateral institutions reflect post-war dynamics and still don't address sovereign debt crises. Central banks have revived old playbooks, and decades of neoliberalism, deregulation, corporate concentration, short-termism, offshoring, and union busting have created systemic fragilities. Crypto bros are the heroes to those who live in a kind of Hayekian fantasy world. And of course, Secretary Yellen, Governor Powell, and President Biden are stuck on the horns of several dilemmas. Now, in the brief time that I have this morning, I want to offer some observations on three 1980s throwbacks that are unfolding against a backdrop of something new. Now, the first throwback concerns crises in US banks. Spring 2023 offered students of bank runs fresh material. We know that social media fueled runs, and that updated the traditional bank run scenario. The banks grew rapidly under lax oversight by regulators that were charged with enforcing already weak yet unnecessarily complex financial regulations that were further undermined in the Trump era. They had fragilities that were revealed by interest rate increases that they failed to hedge against in a time of inflation, and this offered a kind of striking parallel to the S&L crisis of the 1980s. In the failed banks, clients with deposits of a size that households and most businesses could never envision were shielded from the ceiling on individual deposit account insurance. Signature Bank, of course, was involved in crypto, which inexplicably escaped regulators. And the result of the ongoing turmoil is the extension of too big to fail to mid-sized banks, the practical end of the deposit insurance cap, and greater concentration in an already concentrated US banking sector with attendant implications for financial exclusion. Now, a second throwback involves fighting the last war with tight monetary policies. As the COVID crisis wound down, central bankers moved toward QT. Powell, for a while, tried to push back on the narrative that the Fed was not doing enough to fight inflation, and he flagged that the more important culprits were COVID-era supply chain issues, pent-up consumer demand, food price inflation aggravated by the war, and a recovering economy. He eventually, of course, shifted to a less complicated, more politically palatable message that simply channeled a Volcker-esque commitment to doing whatever it takes. As in the 1980s, we don't live in a world where countries of the global north are challenged or obligated to consider the global spillover effects of their policies. QE had strongly negative effects on financial stability and through its effect on currencies, on trade in the global south. Now QT is having devastating and familiar effects on the south, a point to which I'll return shortly. I can't help but think here about Keynes's ideas about addressing asymmetries in the global monetary system, most notably in connection with the burden of adjustment that falls unduly on deficit countries and on the need to control capital in both source and recipient countries. In the North, QT is aggravating already unacceptable levels of inequalities, aggravating fragilities in US finance, including in the non-bank financial sector, with attendant implications for global financial stability. A final throwback that I want to note is the prospect of another lost decade for the global south. QT is having familiar effects on the south, that is currency depreciations, that among other things increase the cost of imported foods at a time when global food prices are already rising. QT aggravates capital flight and introduces the perceived necessity of mirroring northern central bank policies. It induces economic slowdowns, debt distress, and financial instability, austerity, and is associated with increases in poverty. And climate finance in private markets, which is already scarce, becomes ever scarcer and more expensive in a time of rising interest rates. It seems clear that we're poised on the cusp of a new lost decade in the global south with vast debt overhang and widespread debt distress, but one legacy of the current period. The consequences are clearly dire. The debt crisis threatens the prospects of reversing by 2030 the significant COVID-era backtracking on the UN's SDGs. Now, the lost decade of the 1980s, I think, serves as an all too powerful warning of what's to come. That period witnessed economic collapse, intergenerational social and economic losses, and environmental degradation, significantly driven by debt repayment obligations. Debt distress in the 1980s and the 2020s share a common driver, that is monetary policies in the global north, most notably US policy. The enormous contradiction in US monetary policy is that it has a global reach affecting the lives and livelihoods everywhere, and especially in the global south, but its decision-making is decidedly and stubbornly national and strongly tilted in the direction of the wealthy. In economics, we talk about monetary policy spillovers as an externality, but in the context of US monetary policy, that term seems woefully inadequate given the outsized influence of policy beyond the US's borders. Now, what's new in all of this is the context. We are on the road, in my view, to a post-American financial order, and the ride is a rough one. I've argued in some of my recent work that we're in a period between periods, an interregnum between an American-led global financial order and something else. I've referred to this as an emergent post-American financial order. Now, I concede that the US has powerful legacy advantages and that the Fed, the dollar, and the Bretton Woods institutions remain central. But that doesn't undermine the point that financial governance over the past decade bears little resemblance to that of the neoliberal order. Discrete features of an order can persist after their order-giving capacities have begun to evaporate. The scripts of the old neoliberal American financial order were always indefensible, but they kept capitalism running, in a manner of speaking. These strategies work less well now that the US confronts a rapidly changing, fracturing, and increasingly pluripolar world. Recognition of this fact by the Biden administration, I think, might partly explain its recent branding initiative, which it's calling a new Washington consensus. I've also been arguing in recent work that this moment is marked by destructive and productive incoherence. Destructive aspects of incoherence are ubiquitous and severe, as I've already noted. Productive aspects of incoherence are found in the aperture and the possibilities inherent in the space between orders. In this interregnum, there are increased opportunities for institutional and policy evolution and experimentation. We find competition with and challenges to legacy actors and to some defunct orthodoxies. That said, orthodoxy around inflation targets remains firmly in place. We observe expanding financial networks among countries in the global south. An example is the recent expansion of the BRICS group to include 4 new members. Some 13 others have expressed interest in joining the BRICS group. We also find embryonic efforts to create workarounds to US financial power in the face of economic and financial sanctions. This is exemplified by the settlement of some transactions in the international trade arena without the dollar as a vehicle currency, in the slow development of alternatives to the SWIFT system by China and Russia, the expansion of institutions and bilateral financial arrangements outside the Bretton Woods institutions, and support for central bank reserves, principally being provided by petrostates. Now, the fact that the vision of Prime Minister Motley, from whom we'll be hearing in the next session, should be having such a seismic effect on conversations about global financial governance and climate finance represents the best of what an intellectual hero of mine, Albert Hirschman, referred to as possibilism. Hirschman, as some of you might know And if you don't, there's still time to put my book, When Things Don't Fall Apart, in your beach bag. This summer, Kirshner made a powerful case for not writing off what he called processes of change in the small. And he also made a powerful case for resisting the social scientists' predilection for pre-narrating the history of the future. For Kirshner, the scholar faces a moral duty to adopt a stance of possibilism, which is not the same as naivete, since our doing so can help create the discursive conditions for the success of emerging projects that at the outset are so fragile. The obligation to embrace possibilism is most urgent when prospects are most bleak, which they certainly are right now. I hope that one outcome of the conversation across this conference is to call attention to the places where aperture and tension could at best create opportunities, or at the very least highlight the most important places where policymakers, scholars, and civil society actors need to focus their attention on developing new strategies, supporting nations' initiatives, building coalitions, and creating pressure for change. These tasks are urgent for reasons that I think we can all agree upon. And I'll just stop here. Thanks.
See if I can get arranged properly. While I'm arranging, I'll tell you that my principal goal here is to give you all a vital life lesson, which is never follow Ilene on stage. But thanks so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be very brief, I think, although professors always say that. But in this group, to this audience, what I want to do is just give some quick thoughts about what I have to offer. And I think what I have to offer is to speak to you principally as a student of politics more than a student of economics. And in that context, with my kind of politics hat on, we had three themes that were designated for this panel: prospects for monetary policy coordination, the possible implications of the erosion of the dollar as the world's currency, and aspects of questions of sovereign debt. And I'm going to, given what I am capable of speaking of, speak solely to those first two questions about policy coordination and about the role of the dollar. The first question that came up in our marching orders had to do with this aspect of whether coordinated or mutual tightening in the prospects for that with regard to monetary policy internationally were possible. And so with my international relations hat on, I just want to stress that my view is that that type of coordination is extremely unlikely to take place, and if it somehow manages to take place, will be extremely unlikely to be sustained. Why? Because international cooperation is very hard to pull off. You already knew that. What you may have known less is that actually in the world of international cooperation, international monetary cooperation, for a large number of reasons, is very hard. It's not a movie reference, but when I lecture this to my students on monetary cooperation, I invoke the 1981 album by The Who titled, It's Hard. I'll try to have them remember, whenever they think of monetary cooperation, think of The Who. And there are a large number of reasons why I think international monetary cooperation is particularly difficult to establish and maintain. I'll set those aside for now. We can revisit them, I think, in Q&A as I'll more speed through my prepared comments, and we can pick up some of those questions later on, because there are two other things that I wanted to dive into with slightly more elaboration. One has to do with the politics of money, not surprisingly, that monetary policy, monetary coordination, successful or not. I do have a take-home point about this. 20 years ago, I edited a volume called, with a lovely title, Monetary Orders, Ambiguous Economics, Ubiquitous Politics. One of the best chapters in that volume was written by Ilene, so I urge you to go to your used bookstore and seek it out. And the theme which I stick with today is that for many key macroeconomic questions, we do not, that is people who study money, we do not have definitive economic answers about them. Thus, the choice between a variety, a menu of plausible policy options in this realm often fall under that ungainly category that I described: ambiguous economics and ubiquitous politics, by which I mean that the differences in the aggregate economic consequences of one plausible policy choice over another are often modest and often unclear, but that the political consequences of those choices are commonly profound and extraordinarily consequential, and it would be naive not to understand that it was the politics, not the economics, that was driving these policy choices. And so that's something I really want to drive home as a key theme of my comments. Crucially, I also want to emphasize that there is simply not, nor I think I'm going to go ahead and say, will there ever be a quote-unquote politically neutral monetary policy, or some platonic ideal where we know that this is the absolute right policy that must be pursued. And I think that we shouldn't be in the business of even striving for that, because pretending that there is a perfect or platonic posture on many of these policies is to invite donning a cloak that is actually masking powerful political interests that are driving the policy choices that are being made. For example, in that same volume, big fan of that volume, I argued then, and I still hold, that there was simply none, zero, as it were, economics, good economics behind the 2% inflation target. I imagine I'm pushing on an open door here, but I want to dwell on that for a moment to note that there are actually good economic theoretical reasons to believe that that target is too low, and yet somehow it became fixated upon. And again, I think that cannot be explained by economic theory, and therefore we have to ask, well, what can it be explained by? Similarly, I argue that, and this is before our most recent upheavals, that the great 1990s financial and capital deregulation projects were misguided and, again, crucially, unsupported by good economic theory. Yet they were pursued passionately, and again, economics can't explain that. Rather, these drives reflected the strong political preferences of some, even though, in fact, not only were the economics with regard to these issues ambiguous, but indeed they were bad. That is incorrect, wrong, misguided. So this is just really the caveat part of my talk here, which is when we look at monetary policy locally and globally, we don't want to be lulled into the view that good economic theorizing is the most important driver behind the choices that are being made, because I think it is rare that that is going to be the case. That there will be a menu of plausible policy options, and the choice between them will be driven more by politics than economics. The differences across economics, again, relatively modest. Having spent the last 4.5 minutes boasting, I can now tell you some things I was utterly wrong about, which is good. I think we should own our failures, and this is where we're going to transition into the discussion of the role of the dollar as an international currency, possible changes to it, and the possible consequences of that. I've spent lots and lots and lots of time professionally talking about that, writing about that, giving lectures like this about that, and for the most part, I've been wrong. But I have a great rap about it. I argue in setting after setting that the dollar order, and here I'm simply referring to the role of the dollar as an international currency and the breadth of its use and so forth. And I have this wonderful story about how this table that the dollar order rested on these 4 pillars. One pillar was the predominance of the US economy and its extraordinary political stability. It's one pillar. Another, which also was plausible for a very long time, was the belief in the relatively unique invulnerability of the US to financial crises, which was the case for half a century in contrast to much of the world. So if you want to have a global currency, that's a good candidate for one as well. And then, again, back to international relations, I think often overlooked was the fact that for 50 to 75 years, when there was a problem in the world's monetary economy, or you had to deal with the world's money, who made the decisions about that? And it was the US and its political allies and military dependencies. And this political glue was extremely important in holding together some of the tough decisions that had to be made about monetary cooperation. And then the fourth pillar was the lack of plausible alternatives. If not the dollar, what was it going to be? So I used to have this wonderful rap about that. I'd go down the pillars, one, I'd say, this pillar, it's now gone. This pillar is gone. This pillar is gone, right? We see economic diffusion. We see, in the US case, a new and unexpected vulnerability to financial crisis. A theme I didn't mention, but is very important. We saw, I think, a delegitimation of the American model of economic management. Ilene called this, I only knew it as productive incoherence, but now I hear it can also be destructive.
It's not as much fun as a concept as used to be.
Yes, when I knew it, it was the more fun concept of productive incoherence. My phrasing of it was a new heterogeneity of thinking, but again, also pushed back against the role that the dollar had to be the world's money. And again, you look at new players in the world's money game, and they were not political allies and military dependencies of the United States, right? The actors with seats at the table had very different worldviews now, powerful ones, than did the United States. And then, of course, you can't look out the window and look at the United States and think it is still an obviously economically and politically stable place. There seem to be, in the old-fashioned phrase, kind of fewer grown-ups in the room running American politics. So I had this thing, pillar gone, pillar gone, pillar gone, and I said, a table cannot stand on one leg. Guess what? A table could stand on one leg. It turns out that, the reason why I was wrong in my expectation that there would be a relative erosion of the dollar's international role was that lack of alternatives thing was plenty. That the dollar endured in a sustained way simply because, it didn't have to be great. It had to be clearly better than any other alternative. And even with all those pillars being knocked away, it was, and that was essentially the error I was making in my analysis of why I thought the dollar order would gently but clearly, relatively erode steadily over time. Having said all that, I guess I'm a little stubborn, and so I want to make two observations, one cautionary, one less cautionary. The cautionary one is that despite the endurance of the dollar, those pillars I talked about, they've gotten even worse, right? So if they have any role in propping up the dollar order, they're not being restored, they're even more going away. And with regard to the dollar as the only alternative standing, I think that at the moment is still the case, but I would observe that in my estimation, even though we don't necessarily have a great and robust supply of alternatives to the dollar right now, although some may be coming online in the future, I do not think there has ever been a stronger, greater global demand that is preference among actors in the international system to have alternatives to the dollar to use as international money. And I do think that matters. Really, this all depends on whether those actors that can plausibly provide formidable alternatives will take the steps necessary to provide them. And that remains an open question. And so until that happens, as long as the dollar is the only currency standing, I think it will remain robust. My less cautionary tale is that as someone who has contributed in international relations theory side of this story to the role of the dollar as international currency, I must say, as someone who has done this for a very long time, we still do not have a very confident sense of the political economy implications of the relative erosion of the international dollar order. My own take, again, thinking of politics, is that this will come at the expense of some US international influence. I use the word influence carefully, because I do think that many actors in the US, and I think especially abroad, have oversold the extent to which the dollar's role as the world's money has undergirded US hard power. So I just want to close as a student of international politics by saying that I suspect that were we indeed to see a contraction of the dollar's relative international use, it might not have the profound consequences for American power that many predict that it might. And on that international relations note, which is my discipline, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, that's fine. This will work. I'm good. Okay. Oh, okay, that's fine. Oh, the mouse will work, then I'm good. Okay.
Test it one time.
Okay. Well, I'll say thank you very much for having me here. I was at the first MDM conference and was delighted it's just so wonderful to have a chance to talk to people. I come from economics who don't think they're crazy. So I really enjoy having these conversations about the monetary system and how to make it better. I approach these questions from the point of view of macro-financial architecture. And so I think in order to frame how do I understand what's going on right now, I need to spend a few minutes talking about what happened since the 2008 global financial crisis. And when I look at this, there's a key change at the very core of our financial systems. They used to be interbank financing on the basis of unsecured financing. That's the federal funds market in the US, LIBOR in Europe. And there was this huge shift after 2008 to now the core is repo, right? It's collateralized financing. Our models of monetary policy and of money and how monetary policy implementation works, they're founded on the old system. Could you? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm wondering. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay. Yeah, so, and I completely acknowledge these models have left out the whole wage effects and labor effects of what's actually going on here. But the key point I want to make is that with these models central banks have been working with, collateral changes everything. Right? It has price effects and these price connections that go within this model that aren't being modeled. They're not in people's mental frameworks of how the monetary policy system that central banks are using work. And so we don't have a framework for understanding our monetary system anymore, right? The framework we had before doesn't apply. And so we live in a world where the central bankers and the rest of us don't really understand the monetary structure. And so it's a world of surprises. And 2020, we had a liquidity spiral in treasuries and gilts. Like, that took everybody by surprise. Central bankers handled it, when the market maker of last resort, but it was a surprise without question. 2022, there was the UK mini budget crisis, which was very similar. And 2023, it is kind of interesting because the treasury price movements that underlie the Silicon Valley Bank crisis were completely predictable. The Fed's response was not, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. Okay, maybe if I hold it further away, does that help? And then I think the things we don't know, we live in a world of surprises. We don't really understand how this monetary system works. Like, you think there may be more surprises, or like, oh, wait, we didn't think of that before too. But let's talk about the issue of sovereign debt and central bank monetary finance. That comes right into the way the Fed dealt with the Silicon Valley bank crisis, where they did this bank term funding program, and they're lending to banks based on the par value of treasuries, not their market value. This is essentially a way of getting away from that collateralized system, which is completely based on market values, right? I think this is a really good move. The Fed is bringing back unsecured finance as a way of supporting the banks, and it's also this very narrow support because it's only available to banks. But it's a really interesting change, and it's worth noting that not every other central bank can copy this, right? It's literally a violation of the ECB's mandate to do apartheid financing. So there's that aspect going on, and this raises this issue of central bank monetary finance when the central bank is buying sovereign debt to support its value. It's not controversial, certainly now, for liquidity purposes with the market maker of last resort, what happened in 2020. It might have been controversial before then, but the real thing is this idea of central bank monetary finance for longer term purposes. And so this is this case where, you know, literally the government issues debt and the central bank supports its value by buying it. And that is obviously connected to the whole MMT discussion. To be honest, there's a long history of central bank monetary finance. That's one of the things that they do is support governments when they have crises, for example, at war and that kind of thing. And Jens Van Klooster's actually got a really nice article coming out on the ECB on the history within the ECB itself. And you will remember with the sovereign debt crisis and the ECB, there was this period where the ECB is like, no, we can't buy sovereign debt. And then you have the whatever it takes from Draghi that kind of addresses the problem. Van Klooster looks at it and says, well, even historically it was wrong. Like in the formation of the ECB itself, they were allowed to buy sovereign debt, so it was a really weird crisis. It's an interesting question on why did these, why did the myth arise, but let me not take time on that. So this brings us to this issue of monetary tightening in 2023. On the global north side of this issue, hopefully we've already seen the repercussions on banking, but assuming interest rates stay high, there is a huge corporate default wave that is building. So one of the things is a lot of the corporate debt tends to have longer terms. It tends to have this way to be kind of extendable for a year or two, this kind of thing. On the other hand, if interest rates stay high, we have this issue of a corporate default wave. In a lot of ways, in 2009, when they adopted low for long as a policy, that was a bailout of the leveraged loan markets. So remember, we had the bubbles that were brewing were the residential real estate crisis, the commercial real estate crisis, and the leveraged loan crisis. The leveraged loan crisis got bailed out by the low for long policy. It's never realized itself, right? Because low for long allowed the rollover of debt. And there's this issue of very fundamental instability that may exist in our corporate sector. And it's kind of tricky because it doesn't necessarily make sense. Remember, leveraged loans are all about financing private equity and making sure private equity owners are making lots of money, right? Maybe we should let these defaults happen and figure out a way to deal with the economic repercussions of that by supporting workers, by supporting the pension funds that lose money. And so that's another aspect of this whole issue of monetary tightening that obviously it's in tension with Ilene's focus more on, like, what about workers? There's a corporate side of tight money that maybe we need to find a way to manage.
better than we are managing right now. On the global south, Ilene covered this much better than I can. It's not really my expertise, but of course, monetary tightening means that rising debt servicing costs are unaffordable for a lot of countries. One important aspect is that a lot of proposals leave the low-income countries trapped in dollar debt, and that's this problem that's been ongoing for decades. And the solution really seems that there's a need for either debt forgiveness or for dollar funding paired with a domestic currency liability where the multilateral development banks are taking on exchange rate risk. And I believe that's part of what we're going to hear about in much more thorough explanation the next session. And it's also worth pointing out that a lot of low-income countries and middle-income countries are actually paying more in debt service than they need to meet their Paris Accord commitments. So if we could address this problem, we could really help address climate change issues as well. So those are aspects to think of on that path. When it comes to dollar dominance, I'm on the side of, the nature of dollar dominance is really founded on US government policy since the 1970s, where Treasury promoted the dollar in trade, especially with the Saudis. The Fed and FDIC were supporting Eurodollar markets through too big to fail. There's a backstop of international financial markets. It has existed since the 1970s, right? So where does dollar dominance come from? It comes from the US policy of backstopping the international financial system, right? And this is one of the things that makes it really hard to get a competitor, right? Who else wants to have that kind of a job, right? So while you can have these incursions and slow changes, I don't see this as something that can change slowly or by this nice evolution, right? And on the other hand, a lot of what this conference is talking about is the system that we have longer unsustainable, right? And that's where we've had all of these conversations, like Saule's discussion of how do we restabilize a system? How do we build back a solid connection to the real economy and stop the finance of finance, right? Because this backstop, it's a backstop of the US financial system, it's a backstop of the too big to fail banks. We learned in SVB in a lot of ways, it's a backstop of private equity, right? And when we talk about the backstop of private equity, start in 2009 with low for long, come to 2020, in that secondary market corporate credit facility, some of what they were buying, I believe, are CLO ETFs, so they're buying ETFs, but so some of those ETFs are holding leveraged loans, so they're supporting private equity as well. SVB, those huge bank accounts, right, that the FDIC decided had to be paid off in full, who's holding them? Private equity and firms owned by private equity, right? And so this backstop is getting a little bit crazy. It's really a backstop of the US corporate sector, of US corporate debt in a lot of ways at this point. And we need to stop financing finance and take the government backstop back from that. And so that's why I'm totally on board with proposals like Saule's about complete need to restabilize the system, because it just seems like we are going to something ugly at some very indefinite point in the future. Okay, that's.
Well, thank you to our panelists for an incredibly rich set of remarks there. I'm going to start with, I have 3 questions. We'll sort of do round robin style maybe. Oh, can I do that? Yeah, we don't need demo lights for this. And then, with the hopes of, and I don't think it'll be difficult to simulate some discussion amongst our panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. And so I want to start with QE and QT, and both the implications and the alternatives. Ilene described the possibility of a lost decade in the global south in part as a consequence of, at least in part, consequences of tightening. Jonathan said, monetary policy can't be politically neutral. Ilene described it as the central bank making decisions on a national basis with international repercussions, and there's no doubt that that's true. I want to ask our panelists what the alternatives are. Was quantitative easing a mistake? Did quantitative easing necessarily imply that quantitative tightening was going to happen at some point? In other words, did it set in motion the prospect of the lost decade in the global south? And if so, should that have been taken into account by the Federal Reserve in its decision making as a national central bank, or should it really be looking at domestic macroeconomic aggregates and making decisions on that basis? Both from a sort of legal standpoint and from the standpoint of ideal policy. So that's a big question that I think all three of you, I'd love to hear what you all think about that. And anyone can jump in first.
Okay, all right. I'll just start. Oh, I think that's on. Yeah, okay, that is on. Thanks, Morgan. Great questions. I think that, QE was too expansive, it went on for too long. And I think, we can see that certainly in hindsight, that the Fed, kept its foot on the pedal for longer than it should without considering the implications for asset bubbles in the US. I know that was something that Perry talked about yesterday during the afternoon session. And of course, the implications for the global south were obvious. Initially, it looked like a good thing that capital was flowing north to south, but of course it did fuel bubbles in asset markets in the global south in entirely predictable ways, and affected currency prices, as I noted, and had really significant effects on the trade balance for commodity exporters. And so I think, yes, the Fed went too far and didn't consider those global spillover effects. It's of course not, in a legal sense, the obligation of the Fed to consider the global ramifications of its policies, and I think we all know that. But it's also undeniable that there are global spillover effects of U.S. monetary policy, and to act as if there aren't, I think, is a gross miscalculation on the part of the Fed. I know one person who was supposed to, in terms of alternatives, who was going to join us on this panel, John, has developed some interesting ideas. So I know the second part of your question, Morgan, was about kind of alternatives. And in the midst of the crisis of 2008, John developed a kind of interesting set of proposals for what he was calling a green, yellow, red light system, essentially compelling central banks at the behest of the IMF to consider the global spillover effects of their policies and kind of rate them in terms of severity, and then to engage in dialogue at the fund about measures to ameliorate some of those spillover effects. And I thought that was, quite an interesting, quite radical idea. Politically, of course, it didn't really have a chance to get a proper airing. But when we think about the interconnections among global financial markets, the failure of great powers like the US to think about spillover effects, I think is a significant problem, and we're now dealing with the overhang of that problem, and I think, as I noted, we will for many years to come.
I'll take a slightly different tack in that I want to give 1.5 cheers for QE. just in context, in contextualizing why I think it was okay, even if it went on too long and had the spillover effects that we're talking about. One is, I remain very sensitive to the precipice at which we found ourselves during the global financial crisis, and the fact that extraordinary and innovative emergency measures were taken, I think were crucial, and we were lucky to have it. Did they err over time in the opposite direction? Possibly, but in that context, I just think it was very important. And then secondly, back to politics, the monetary authorities have been asked to do too much. And the reason why they've been asked to do too much is because our political system has failed. And so the tools that ought to have been deployed in order to address some of the problems that emerged not at the side of the global financial crisis, but in the wake of the global financial crisis, were unavailable politically, and therefore it was left to monetary authorities to do more than they really should have been asked to do to try and do the best they can to manage a very difficult situation. So I don't think it was an optimal tool, and I think it was overused, but it was to some extent thrust upon monetary authorities due to political paralysis.
I certainly will second that, quantitative easing, once they had decided on the low for long policy, there just weren't a lot of choices, especially where the fiscal authorities are going to step in and do a lot. So I have sympathy for why it took place. In terms of the Federal Reserve, taking greater account of its effect on the global South, absolutely that would be good, but I do think the underlying problem is global financial architecture, right? So it's like if we could find a way to treat aid and loans to the global South on a way that does not end up dollar denominated and euro denominated. So essentially you need a foreign exchange rate taken by the multilateral development banks. This foreign exchange rate risk taken by the multilateral development banks, by the lenders. That should be done up front. Like if the US wants to give a loan to a low income country, give the dollars, take the conversion, take the liability in the local currency, which then gives the lender a kind of equity stake, right, in that country, which would be so much better as just a way of thinking about things. So I would say we need to target the global financial architecture more than let's try and fix, Federal Reserve decision making, because I don't think that's the level at which it should be addressed.
I'm sorry, just one more thing that I wanted to add. I think there's been an interesting debate at central banks around the issue of their goals and their responsibilities. And I know we spoke on the first day of the conference about the kind of the network for greening central banks and the kind of prospects of that vision being realized. But around midpoint of the crisis of 2008, through the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, there were discussions at central banks, including the US Fed, and even Governor Carolyn talked about using monetary policy as an instrument to fight structural racism, climate change, asset bubbles, inequalities of various sorts. Christine Lagarde also made some similar comments from the helm of the ECB. And of course, Powell and Lagarde got hammered by hardliners within their banks to say, no, that's not the focus. Let's not broaden the mandate of central banks in any of these kinds of unacceptable ways. And that has left the Fed and the ECB and other central banks with very limited room to maneuver. And I think also, for the reasons that Jonathan mentioned, that central banks have become the only responsible policymakers in the room. So there are no alternatives right now in the policy toolkit because of the political climate.
So let me follow up. Since we have experts in politics here, one takeaway from the discussion is that there's not really much of an alternative. Our politics is dysfunctional. Maybe a robust fiscal policy would have been superior to a central bank that massively expands its balance sheet, and as Eileen points out, that has implications, it's disproportionately benefits the wealthy. But the central bank only has the tools that it has. On the other hand, does the prospect of the central bank doing so itself take pressure off of the political process to engineer more robust fiscal policy? You know, we talk in the central banking world about credible commitments a lot, but a credible commitment not to pursue QE, at least not on the scale at which it was pursued, actually induce or have some prospect or possibility of inducing the political system to deal with macroeconomic crises in a more equitable way. In other words, it's a little bit of a chicken egg question, but I'm curious for our political experts how they think about that.
I'd like to jump in on that because I think it's important, it may be more important for politics than some of the things that we're talking about today. But I think you're exactly right to say or suggest that the immediate emergency response by authorities to the global financial crisis was successful to the extent that it then allowed political actors to return to their trenches. And so in the heat of the moment, everybody said, we are on the precipice of an absolute fundamental economic meltdown, and whatever has to be done to stop that from happening has to be done. And that was done, and it was successful in putting out the raging inferno, right? But a large financial crisis tends to be followed by an economic downturn. And so what the appropriate policies to pursue an economic downturn then fall over toward the fiscal side more than the monetary side, which, all of the bullets have been fired by that point anyway. But then we could see the return to politics as usual. And so the fiscal policy and the reforms to the system that ought to have been introduced afterwards, the urgency of doing that was reduced by the relative success of putting out that raging fire. Barry Eichengreen in his book, Hall of Mirrors, has a good phrase about this, comparing the Great Depression to the global financial crisis, in which he says that the Great Depression brought about an implosion so complete that fundamental reforms were possible. And so you had all of the fundamental changes in the 1930s, the banking reforms, and also the more robust approach to fiscal policy that you did not have after the global financial crisis because it was stopped before the implosion was so complete. And I do think that was consequential. And I, as a political scientist, although I don't really use Bunsen burners, but as a political scientist, I don't think we live in a world of a post-financial crisis world. I think we live in the world of the post-financial crisis. That is the period of political economy management of the decade that followed the resolution of the worst of the crisis. And I think that, more than anything, is responsible for the political horror show that we find ourselves in the midst of.
I think there's also an issue of, it's so much easier to say that the central banks should set down the line so that the fiscal authorities will do what they need to do. And I just remember asking the questions of some central bankers when Europe was very, very much under pressure. And I kind of said, okay, let's draw an analogy with what went on before the Great Depression, where the Bank of England went off gold in 1931. If in 1925, people had known the Bank of England was going to go off gold, you could have started the adjustment process so much earlier and not had 6 years of central banks trying to make everything work. So in retrospect, it would have been better if the central banks had held the line in 1925 and kind of said, we're not going to support things. The fiscal authorities have to get everything sorted now. And so tying that into the European crisis, I was like, well, so if the euro is going to fall apart, what should your policy be? It would be completely different than what you're doing. And there were central bankers, and they said, but we have to work with the political authorities. We essentially have to support the political authorities in doing what seems like the right thing, right? In other words, so in some sense, the central bankers have to work with the political authorities, right? I mean, in other words, they're part of the supportive structure here, and they're not going to play a game of chicken with the political authorities. It's just, I don't think it's a realistic thing to expect. Yeah.
I think Morgan, you're right to point out that there's a game of brinksmanship that has gone on both, the 2008 crisis and during the COVID crisis between central banks and fiscal authorities. And the fact that fiscal authorities are paralyzed, particularly in the US context, did put undue pressure on the Fed to do whatever it takes, right, to use Draghi's phrase, and that's unfortunate. And of course, we saw that same kind of brinksmanship scenario play out, with the recent US budget standoff as well, with, Yellen constantly trying to invoke fiscal responsibility and needs, and of course, that fell on deaf ears for elected officials. That said, I think, these two crises with COVID and the 2008 crisis, had some effects of normalizing, unconventional monetary policies, right? We know that central banks were able to kind of throw the whole toolkit, with the kind of effects that we talked about earlier in terms of then creating fragilities, but they could do whatever it takes. Even the IMF was ultimately during the 2008 crisis and at least early in the COVID crisis, reshaped its narrative, such that you had the managing director of the IMF, Svetlana Georgieva, that said, let's use giant bazookas. That was kind of her widely reported phrase to address the fallout of the crisis. And interestingly, her chief economist then quipped, but keep receipts, which reflects that kind of internal tension at the fund. Spend as much as you can, but know that you're going to have to pay for it big time later, which is of course exactly what's happening now. But a number of tools that at least in many country contexts, most notably the US, would have been politically impossible, like cash transfers that were ultimately made during the crisis, propping up non-financial firms, right? Things that just don't happen in the US were made possible by the exigencies of the crisis. Obviously, there are all sorts of imperfections in those programs, but it did help to normalize a set of strategies that it might be hard to kind of now not roll out during the next crisis, and that might be why we saw this kind of strange ad hoc reactions to banking crises recently in the US. I'd also note that these crises, both COVID and the 2008 crisis, brought some actors to the table who were resistant to multilateralism, and in fact hostile to multilateralism, in some sense brought the G8 together and created conditions where the G8 morphed into the G20 during the crisis of 2008. And in that sense, it's a change in the architecture of who has a seat at the table. And I think that's an important transformation that's been occasioned by the recent crises.
So this leads nicely. So I'm going to pivot to the role of the dollar and the global role of the dollar. And Jonathan, I think, is a model for all of us in stating he was wrong, and something we can all do more. I certainly would like to do more of. And so this is a topic that all three of you touched on in somewhat different ways. Ilene, you suggested we're in an interregnum, and there's potentially an emerging post-American financial order. I interpreted Carolyn to suggest that maybe things might be a little stickier than that. I might be oversimplifying a bit, but and so I'm going to ask the question this way. I'm going to ask this to Ilene, and everyone can chime in. I hosted a conference at Vanderbilt recently, and Zoltan Pozsar was there, and talking about this set of issues. And he made a prediction. I won't say what it is. We were under Chatham House rules, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. But we also had a Fed official there that I won't name, who asked Zoltan. He said, "I'm not going to say you're wrong, but suppose you're wrong. How are you In other words, he was asking Zoltan to sort of play devil's advocate. In what way, if 10 years from now your prediction doesn't pan out to have been accurate, what will you have missed? What's the way in which you will have been wrong? So suppose 10 years from now the dollar dominance remains unabated. What were what were the causes of the prediction that we might be entering a post-American financial order? Why didn't it pan out the way that you might expect? I'm not saying you predicted that this is a certainty by any stretch, but I'm interested in sort of, you mentioned Hirschman and not predicting, writing the history of the future. There's a sense in which we're making predictions, we're always writing the history of the future, so I'm interested in how you think that might play out.
Sure. Good question, and just to be clear, to the extent that I'm looking ahead, I don't see the dollar going away. I mean, so when I talk about a post-American financial order, I'm talking about the kind of broader context of the shape and character of the global financial system. I think there are many important ways that the dollar is hardwired into the global financial system, like when we think about derivative contracts, right, where the dollar plays a critically important role in most global derivative contracts, pricing of many commodities, thinking about the chips and the SWIFT system, all of the different ways that we've come to realize that the dollar, even more than we might have appreciated prior to the war in Ukraine, that the dollar still matters despite the incredible dysfunction in the US, and perhaps it's because the dollar is the cleanest shirt in the dirty laundry basket, as just to kind of follow on what Jonathan said. So when I talk about this idea of a post-American financial order, I'm really focusing on things like the norms around the idealization of the American financial model, the role of American-led institutions in a global financial order, the model of liberalization, high levels of liquidity, etc. So just to be clear about that, but I'm working, you didn't say that I was predicting the end of the dollar, but I just feel like I always need to clarify that. I think the things that could potentially compromise the kind of sense that what's emerging is a much more kind of multipolar global financial order, and I call it pluripolar in a lot of my work, is, if the US were to get its act together, if this idea of a new Washington consensus, which at this point seems to have little content, though Jake Sullivan is certainly doing his best to sell us on the idea that it represents a kind of modernization of US-led multilateralism, a more egalitarian form of US-led multilateralism. I'm not so sure about that, if that is actually built out in some kind of meaningful way so that it actually reshapes the global dialogue around economic governance and institutions of economic governance. That could be very helpful to re-legitimizing the American financial order. So, that may depend on the next election, whether the US continues to shoot itself in the foot and to what extent it does that. So I think that that's kind of one giant question mark that hangs over this issue. And another is, does China stumble? What China does really matters. And we don't know, I think we're all getting very, confusing signals from the Chinese government about its economic ambitions and the extent to which it can actually carry out those economic ambitions. And so I think that's another factor that matters. Whether the BRICS, a kind of final factor, I would just note, whether the BRICS really do expand in meaningful ways to incorporate more petro-states into the BRICS architecture, I think could really matter in terms of the financial firepower, not just of Chinese-led institutions, but also BRICS-led financial institutions, right? Some of the new members of the BRICS are petro-states, and so add a lot of financial capacity. Some of the 19 prospective new members are also states that have a lot of financial capacity, but some are quite poor, and depending on how those discussions go in South Africa this August, that will shape the financial power and also the potential cohesiveness of a very fractured group, right? The BRICS are a little bit like the Eurozone. It's a very unhappy marriage. And who joins that marriage really shapes its ability to move forward or not. And then the last thing, what happens to US-led multilateral institutions, the IMF and the World Bank? We know Banga is quite new in his role. He has said a lot about modernizing governance at the World Bank and making the World Bank relevant again. We don't know if he will do that, and if he will do that in conjunction with the IMF, or whether those institutions will continue to be kind of stuck in the world in which they were created, in the world of the post-war order. And I think these are some of the factors that really affect this question of where the US will be in the global financial world if we were meeting 10 years from now.
Well, I have two more questions that I'm not going to ask. I'm going to tell you what the questions are, but I want to open this up to the audience since we have about 15 minutes left. But I think this question of implications of the potential shift away from the dollar's hegemonic status. Jonathan, one of the things you mentioned was maybe it's less essential to American hard power than has been oftentimes assumed, and that's a topic I would be interested in seeing explored. And the other I wanted to ask, which is maybe more toward Carolyn, is about the swap lines specifically as a component of the dollar's role in the global reverberations of central bank policy. And specifically, we're going to have a conversation, I think, about the swap lines later this afternoon in one of the panels, and so we'll have an opportunity to discuss that further. I'm looking at John Crawford because I know he's written on this. Carolyn refers to stop financing finance, and I think that's a nice pithy statement. And the swap lines are sort of a central aspect of the support. Carolyn really identifies the swap lines and their genesis really in the 70s in a significant way, backstopping the euro-dollar market as a real key cornerstone of the dollar's continuing dominant status. And I'm interested in a discussion, if we can get there in the Q&A, and we may not because we can't touch on everything, but about how that transition can be made to happen. Those are the questions that are left on my list that I'm not going to ask our panelists to answer right now because I'm interested in hearing the questions from everyone else. But if you have thoughts on those questions that intersect with the questions that you received, then I think those would be useful for us to talk about. So on that note, we don't have anyone with the mic, do we? Or do we? Oh, yes, we do. I'm sorry. Okay.
Okay, I would like to ask Carolyn to amplify one of her points. We think of the central banks as being omniscient and omnipotent, but if I hear her correctly, she is saying the Fed had a policy which it didn't predict the ramifications because the Fed is in an old model instead of the new model of collateralization. And so the impacts were not just third world, but at home, creating more financial instability in spite of its best efforts. So I was wondering if you could expand on that, and what are the prospects of the Fed learning its new financial system in time to prevent the next wave of default that we see coming?
So I think, all right, so if you're gonna look at the 2008 crisis, it was a crisis of repo, but in a lot of ways it was a crisis of private sector repo, right? So it was the the repo of mortgage-backed securities and the CDOs and this kind of thing are the classic example of what fell apart, and the Fed put in all of these structures to support that, the term securities lending facility, the PDCF, the primary dealer credit facility, and these were ways to essentially backstop that private sector repo facility by trading treasury collateral for the collateral that used to be part of the repo market. So when the repo market first fell apart, it fell apart on a private sector basis. So the idea behind a lot of the reforms of the repo market was, well, let's make it treasury, let's make it sovereign debt, the good sovereign debt. If it's treasury and it's gilts and it's bonds, we will solve the problem because we didn't have a crisis in those in 2008, right? And the reason why I say it's kind of like proof that they didn't understand the system, like everybody was just gobsmacked by what happened in March 2020 to treasuries. Right? And it's just, and because, wait a minute, we thought we fixed the repo market by making it safe debt, right? And it's like, and instead what you figured out was that, well, the repo market finds the least safe debt in the portfolio and sells it, right? And so it's, to me, it's just crystal clear, they didn't have a model of the collateral markets they were working with, and that's why we got there. So I kind of think there's very solid evidence of this, and I mean I've written about it in papers, the collateral supply effect on central bank policy. And so I happen, when I look at the Silicon Valley bailout thing, is the BTFP, which I'm not going to remember what it stands for. The fact that they're financing treasuries on a par basis, this to me is the Fed limit, right? This to me is the Fed saying, oh yeah, wait a minute, we want to get a little bit away from the collateralized system, especially when we're dealing with banks, and it's kind of really similar to discount window lending. So they're willing to do the unsecured lending and kind of start stepping away from collateralized lending, given that, you know, the difference between the par value and the market value is just unsecured lending. And so I do think the Fed has a learning process. I came out of economics, I came out of the modeling tradition. I would love to see someone develop a model that takes collateral seriously. I have never seen an economic model that really starts to try and engage with what does collateral mean to prices and this kind of thing. And so I think that's what the Fed needs to really get a grasp on what might happen in the future. But yeah, maybe it's not an impossible rating model, I don't know.
Leah Rojani had this, but she got an emergency kit call and she handed it to me, so I'm just gonna manage that. My question is for everyone. Can you create a global key currency on purpose? When we talk about the dollar, a lot of what backstops the dollar seems to be adaptations to things that were happening beyond the United States control. Swap lines were a recognition of euro-dollar deposits. They saw that liability, it happened on its own, and they decided over time that they had to backstop it. It's the Eric Kelliner story where sort of the Fed is dragged into global markets rather than pushing, creating it. The Greta Kirshner story about treasuries is that there wasn't a plan to create treasuries as sort of a global money. It was that the Reagan administration realized that they could just keep selling them and it was going to work out. So when there have been attempts to create global currencies, sort of using a better governance model of SDR. They sort of don't work because it's very difficult to create a global governance model. So when I see the BRICS trying to figure out how to compete with the dollar, it always feels like Esperanto, like it's a really neat idea, but that's not how language works. So it feels like the dollar was created, but it sort of seems like America got dragged into the dollar. So is it possible for any other actor to, on purpose, recreate what has happened in the last 40 years of the dollar?
I think the short answer I would give is no. But with Ilene, I do want to stress that even when I was in the height of my dollar boom days, it was really about the relative diminution of the dollar. The dollar wasn't going to kind of vanish or even need to be overtaken. rather than there would be more of a multiplicity of international currencies that were used as international currency. And I do think that there's the prospect for that happening. A lot of that has to do with decisions made by other plausible suppliers of international money. China, again, would be the most obvious example of that. China would appear to have very ambivalent feelings about how much they want the currency to be used in that way. And so that's a big choice. But just making one up, again, back with my international relations hat, I'm deeply skeptical. Ilene referred to the BRICS as an unhappy marriage, comparing them to the euro. The euro is an unhappy marriage. I think that the BRICS are an awkward singles mixer. I just don't see the coherence there to get together and do something that ambitious. So I do think, again, the dollar remains the only game in town. A player like China, should it want to, and I think the place to watch for that would be in the Middle East, allow for a greater role for the RMB that would come at the dollar's expense. And it would also likely come in the wake of another exogenous, probably geopolitical shock that might alter the assessments of actors about how they wanted to organize their international economic relations.
I'll just say briefly, I agree. I think that the answer has to be no, that a global currency can't just be created because some countries have the aspiration. And I'll just note, as probably many of you know, that, in the early days of the crisis of 2008, the Chinese central bank advanced a very widely discussed proposal for the creation of an SDR-like global currency. And then many people kind of read into that kind of return to some ideas from the late 1960s for a global currency. And I think that when that proposal came out, or that white paper came out of the Chinese central bank, that was really rhetorical. I mean, it was just a way of taking a shot at the US, appropriately so, to say, yes, you've been lecturing us for years about how great your financial system is, and look, it's caused a global financial crisis. I don't think the Chinese government ever had any actual interest in the RMB being a global currency or an SDR-like currency becoming a global currency, and I don't see that as likely. And the BRICS, there's been some discussion on the sidelines of the BRICS Plus group, as it's now being called, about the creation of a BRICS currency, which I also think is really a rhetorical strategy rather than a kind of meaningful proposal. Expansion of the new development bank of the BRICS, that's real, but the idea of a BRICS-led currency, and I think even a BRICS-led credit rating agency, that those are kind of rhetorical posturing by some BRICS enthusiasts.
Yeah, I would basically agree with the skepticism, and I guess I wanted to address one other issue in terms of the idea that the US just kind of wandered into this role, like particularly after the end of Bretton Woods, when we had this, you had the euro-dollar system in the 1970s. It was flexible exchange rates. I mean, to be honest, nobody knew how stable the system was going to be, right? And it was at that moment, I think, that the US, in part too big to fail policies, bailing out banks that if you hadn't bailed them out would have destabilized the euro-dollar market, the Franklin National. Then even also like instruments, we had this really funky regulatory system where the OCC was permitting a financial instrument that was not accepted by the FDIC or the Fed, and all the US banks know not to touch it, and the European banks don't. And so then, you end up saying, oh, okay, the lax regulation is okay, because we don't want to upset the international markets. So the US gets into this, I think, in part, it's not specifically to support the dollar, but it's to keep euro-dollar markets from being unstable. So it's basically to support the dollar, right? So I think there's a lot of conscious policy going on in this in the 1970s.
Time for maybe two more, depending on how long they take.
Hello. Okay, thank you. My name is Shengbei Guo. So when we discuss questions regarding QE, QT, and timing versus some of the potential problems. So in fact, I have two questions on related issue. The first one is about fiscal policy. Because what was not discussed during the latest round of QE, there was a massive fiscal program. And for example, in 2021, the fiscal deficit reached out to like 14% of GDP. So normally when you have this kind of fiscal deficit, so much bigger than before, it will normally lead to a much bigger household saving, which make the balance sheet for household much stronger. Two, lead to very strong profit growth, which is make the balance sheet of corporation much stronger, which lay the foundation for later expansion even after QT, right? Of course, it also led to the third element, which is a temporary worsening of trade deficit. Of course, that given the lockdown, given other things, is a tolerable problem. So now, of course, that's really, when I look at QE versus QT, there is an issue regarding how to look at Fed action in context of that type of the fiscal policy response. But now with QT and massive interest rate increases, it actually, I think Ilene talked about China, right? So I think everybody should probably is aware that China is a legitimate threat to the US economic and dollar and financial dominance, right? So what this effect of the super quick interest rate hiking and QT type of program with obvious problem for global south, right? I think it's kind of obvious. But more importantly, it actually probably threatened China's combined financial and economic system much more directly. So it really have a potential China angle into it as well. So is this possible, really, regarding both the fiscal policy and also the China angle? Is it possible that we may have designed or stumbled into, in fact, a rare occurrence of highly effective policy response? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I'm not that much on top of what's going on in China or how the connections with what's going on in China work. So I mean, I understand. I'm not too sure how it is that type. I guess I'm not mapping the channels of how tight money has such a strong effect on China, so I don't really know how to answer that one. You guys on top of China and the connections with China?
I guess, well, I would just, it's a really interesting question. I've not thought about QT as a kind of mechanism for ring fencing China, which would be, okay, a bit of my read on your question. I mean, of course, QT is helping to reverse the direction of capital flows, right, back toward the US in general. In that sense, we might say it could have some negative effects on the Chinese economy. I'm not sure. I think what's probably somewhat more meaningful in terms of the US striking back at China is the reshoring phenomenon. That's part of this so-called, new Washington consensus, that to the extent that US policymakers have been forced, I think because of COVID-era supply chain issues, to recognize that in the drive toward efficiency and neoliberalism and outshoring and low-cost production, they made the US economy incredibly vulnerable to the kinds of supply shocks during COVID, and now we can understand the whole reshoring phenomenon as part of that. That could have probably potentially more negative effects on China than at least I could immediately envision associated with QT. But there may be some issues about the reversing the direction of the flow of capital away from China back to the US that might be a kind of additional benefit from the US's perspective.
Well, as much as I'd like to continue with the questions, I think we've got to call on the session here. Let's thank our panelists for a really great session.